Hey, good afternoon. We'll call the meeting to order. And are there any items which council want to declare pecuniary or a conflict of interest? Seeing none, we'll move on. Councillor Pauls is away today for a funeral, so he won't be joining us. 3.1 is, well, why don't we adopt the agenda, I guess. It would be the first thing, eh? Anybody care to do that? Councillor Lloyd moves the agenda as presented. All in favor? Then the minutes. 3.1. Councillor Chapman.
Just one quick, it's just more of a grammatical thing on items 064, 7.3. Second bullet. Chapman noted that the appeals are borne at the cost to the hosting municipality. With that, I'll make a motion to adopt the minutes as presented, as amended.
You get the amendment?
Yeah.
Any other discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Okay. And then 4.1, update on the sentences.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. I'm pleased to report that our census is now in full swing. We sent out pin letters a week ago to all residents in town, 3,544 of them, and informing residents what's going on. There's also the bulletins that you see around town, the billboard bulletins, placed in 3 different locations as well. It's on our website as well as in the newsletter. It's been in several times too, so people know it's coming and to inform them that people will be coming to their door. We've had a really great response so far of people doing the online or phoning or coming in. So as of about 20 minutes before coming into the meeting, we've already captured 3,016 people of our population, which equates to 32.2%. So that's really, really great results so far. So the enumerators just started today out on the streets, so they're now knocking on doors, including a placard if they're not at home, so that the resident still is aware of what options they have to follow up and provide the information. So things are going really well. I'm really, really pleased. At the same time, we're also capturing email addresses to create a database so that we can easily inform residents of things going on, land matters, maybe even emergency information or cultural activities going on. So that's been really great. It's been really well received, and people are really excited to provide the information. And for providing their information, we are awarding a one-time family swim pass. So we will be handing over a list to the pool. So it's been going really well as well.
Thank you, Lana. Is there any questions of Lana? Councillor Chapman?
Thank you, Worship. It's just encouraging to hear such good numbers and good results already. And what would be your assessment if you were able to accomplish 100% before the June 30th deadline?
Well, if we capture, well, it is our intent to capture 100%. That is the goal, ultimately. So the census enumerators have 6 weeks to go out and do what they can, and then the other 5 weeks is left for myself to go out in teams with the other administrative internal people that I have from the office, and then we're going to go and do cleanup of some of the more difficult ones that are people that have been unreachable or trying to get the information from. So the goal is still 100%, so I'll be very pleased.
So when you say you achieved that much percent, but that's based on the 8215, right?
Yeah, based on our current population of 8,215, so we've captured 32.2% of that right now, but I'm quite certain that we'll exceed that.
So hopefully you'll get to 125%.
Yeah.
Kevin, you want to, or, okay. All right. Any other questions for Lana? Okay, thank you very much for your report, Lana. And the recommendation is that council receive the census update for information. Does Councillor Simpson makes that motion? All in favor? Okay, now I know why Kalen was, got his finger poised above the top button, so 4.2 is his item.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. I'll be providing an update with respect to item 4.2 and the investigation regarding the West Nile and the birds of prey matter. The town of Coaldale has retained Solstice Environmental Management out of Edmonton to conduct an expert, objective, and thorough review of the events contributing to the bird deaths at the Alberta Birds of Prey Centre in August 2018, as well as an assessment of how best to manage the annual threat of West Nile virus in Coaldale and the surrounding areas in the future. The objectives of Solstice Environmental Management are to establish findings of fact and to provide recommendations on best practices on how risk of West Nile virus in Coaldale can be mitigated by all parties in the future. It is anticipated that the full report will be submitted to Council for review by the end of June 2019. The investigator will be contacting the relevant parties directly. Should there be any questions with respect to this update, they can be channeled to myself. And that concludes my update.
Okay, thank you, Kalen, for that update. Is there any questions through the Kalen on 4.2? Councillor Chapman?
Thank you, Worship, and through to Kalen. Thank you so much for that report. You mentioned in your report there about Coaldale and area. Are you suggesting that the area would be outside of the town of Coaldale?
That's correct. Yeah, given that mosquitoes fly and that there's a number of water bodies, wetlands, farmsteads, dugouts, crops in and around the area, it's important to look at Coaldale and the surrounding area as all one piece, different pieces to the same puzzle.
Would this be an exercise you might want to accomplish with Lethbridge County?
It's possible. I think we'll take that one step at a time, and we'll let the investigator map out the steps. Right now, we hired them. We want this to be as independent as possible, and we'll take our cues from the experts on this, but it's certainly possible that that may be something that they proceed with as part of a step 2 in the process.
Any other questions for administration? Okay, seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to receive that verbal report for information. Councillor Chapman moves. Any further discussion? All in favor? Okay, that's carried. Okay, and then we have item 6.1. Kyle will present on that.
Okay, good afternoon. So we have the first reading in front of you for the boring bylaw for the recreation center. So this is for the design and construction for the recreation center. Boring bylaw $10 million to not exceed a period of 25 years repayment and not to exceed an interest rate of 4%. Just to note, we're bringing this towards you now too, because we can't start any of the design until the boring bylaw has been approved. Also, it's good timing too for an interest rate. When we did the budget back in November, the rates have decreased by about 1/3 of a point already, and they're right now we're sitting at about 3.1%. So it's a good rate. So we're looking to get this set up now to save some extra cash. So just see if there's any questions on that bylaw.
Any questions through to administration on item 6.1? Councillor Chapman?
Thank you, Worship. Just more of, maybe it might be the way I read it, but under number 4, it talks about the municipality shall levy and raise in each year municipal taxes sufficient to pay for the indebtedness. Now, is that an all-encompassing statement, or are we looking at just the levy part on the $10 or $120 per year as a tax?
It's more of just a general statement for the bylaw, and just saying, you know, the municipality will raise the funds. So the intention is to use the rec levy to raise the funds to pay for this. So that's just kind of the general statement for the bylaw.
Okay, so it doesn't assume a municipal tax to be a part of that.
No, this is just part of the borrowing part of it. And it'll just say that it'll be repaid through the municipality collection, levy, tax, etc.
Thank you.
That's just pro forma wording, basically. If we were going to do a water service commission, then the recovery of the money would be through the fees and whatnot levied through that source. And,
Yeah, just standard wording, standard legal wording.
okay. And Councillor Simpson?
I'll make a motion to give the first reading for the borrowing bylaw 752-B-03-19 for the design and construction of the recreation facility on municipal owned property.
Okay, thank you. We have Councillor Simpson sponsoring first reading of the borrowing bylaw. Is there any discussion? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. And then 7.1, we have Kyle again to speak about the reserve transfer adjustment.
So we're close to getting our annual audited financial statements done. There's just a little housekeeping that has to be done before that. Part of the 2018 draft financial statements, there are surpluses and deficits in the various departments. What the council decides to do with that at the end of each year generally is move through restricted reserves or unrestricted reserves. What you have in front of you here is kind of a breakdown of how the surplus has been, surplus and deficit for the year has been allocated to the various departments. We are proposing that we keep those funds within the various departments going forward. And so this is just to allocate those accordingly. So you have some information on the second page that details where the recommendation is, from which department and what it would be used for in the future. Just looking to see if it's now council's ability to move funds around as they please from one reserve to another. If there's any questions on this, or I can ask.
I'll open the floor for questioning by council if they have any. Councillor Lloyd?
Thank you, Your Worship. Is this something that's done every year, periodically? How often do you do this transfer?
This is generally done, this type of transfer is done this time of the year, once a year. So our audited financial statements are not quite complete. In order to have those completed, we need to have these reserve transfers approved by council first. So this has to happen before our annual financial statements can be completed. Just to provide some clarity in that chart there, you know, you have some numbers in brackets. Those are the surplus, and the numbers without brackets are the deficits in each department for the year. If there's any questions on those numbers, where they come from, I can provide context if needed.
Hey, Kaylin, you want to make a comment?
Just following on the heels of Councillor Lloyd there, on a longer term forecast as part of the strategic planning process with council in the fall, once we have our infrastructure master plan and a number of our other study documents complete, one of the routine discussion items with council will be on the future outlook of reserves and how much money to allocate in specific capital reserves, for example, based on the infrastructure needs and requirements. So this is specific to the financial statements and audit process, but there will also be the strategic planning element, which will take place October, November each year with council once we have those studies complete, to have more of that long range, higher level planning process in place.
Councillor Chapman?
Yeah, thank you, Worship, and just thank you, Kyle, for that clarity. And I think the element of transparency, I'll make the motion to to authorize the transfer reserves as presented.
Okay, any discussion on that? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? And that's carried unanimously. Thank you. And then the next item is we have Cameron to present.
All right. Thank you. So item before council, what we've called the vacant residential tax policy, is an investigation into the creation fundamentally of a subclass within the assessment classes that are available for application of a mill rate as part of the upcoming mill rate bylaw. What we're examining here is the possibility of creating a second residential mill rate known as a vacant residential mill rate or vacant residential tax rate that would be applied to various types of property that meet certain criteria in order to adjust the amount of tax that is ultimately levied against certain types of property. So nothing involved in what's being proposed within this document involves the raising of additional tax revenue. It's simply about adjusting where tax revenue is applied with respect to various residential properties. If you take a look at the policy as it's been prepared, fundamentally, the policy statement here, the town of Coaldale will encourage development of vacant residential lands through the use of a higher rate of municipal property taxation on those lands which have remained vacant for a defined period of time. Fundamentally, what we've tried to do in crafting this policy for consideration is to consider or basically to acknowledge the fact that there are certain costs associated with properties that remain vacant for a long period of time with respect to things like water and storm and sewer infrastructure and road infrastructure, recognizing that vacant properties, particularly properties that remain vacant in the middle of developed neighborhoods, that these properties that remain vacant for a large period of time pay fundamentally a substantially lower amount of tax than their neighbors which are developed but still have a certain frontage and certain costs associated with them. So the idea behind the crafting of this policy was to balance the desire to use the tax rate to both ensure the fair amount of taxes paid by those properties and also potentially to incentivize the ultimate development of those properties with ensuring that we're not penalizing properties that remain vacant for a smaller amount of time or that have some other reason for remaining vacant, and try to find a balance with respect to our approach there. Without going through every detail of the policy, if you take a look at what's been prepared here under standards, this policy as it's crafted currently suggests that 5 years would be the period at which vacant properties would become subject to a vacant property mill rate, whatever that mill rate may be. So that there are a number of instances where that may be the case. That would either be property that was created through subdivision that has remained vacant for a period of 5 or more years, or potentially that could be a property that was previously developed. For example, a property that was had a house on it built in the 40s. If that house was torn down 15 years ago and has remained vacant since then that property would also be subject to taxation, to the additional or the higher mill rate, I should say. Taking a look here, applicable properties, there are 3 criteria which we're suggesting are appropriate for consideration, and these properties would need to meet all 3 of these criteria. So we have outlined zoning requirements that would need to be in place to ensure that only the proper types of residential properties would be subject. Additionally, we outline here making it very clear how period of vacancy is established, as I discussed, with respect to how a property that previously had been developed and then had been torn down. And lastly, that the property is considered to be fully serviced and developable for that period. So for example, if there's a property that doesn't have the ability to connect to sewer, or doesn't have road access or something like that, those properties would not be eligible to be assessed under these criteria. Also, explicitly listing certain properties which are excluded. So, for example, properties that are larger than 10 acres in size, which can be further subdivided, haven't reached sort of their state of ultimate residential subdivision, would be excluded. Properties where there are some properties that might be 2 lots, but they're being used functionally as 1 lot. So you've got a house, you've got the area fenced and developed, with yard and that sort of thing. Those properties would be excluded. And lastly, properties assessed as farmland would be excluded. In this case, and I should point, there's a typo under applicable municipal tax. The ratio in this case is a 2-to-1 ratio. Any ratio and any tax rate variation is a reasonable approach for council. We've started the discussion at a 2-to-1 ratio. The idea here is fundamentally that a bare lot would receive the application of a mill rate that is twice that of a developed lot. So if a typical house that has a $400,000 assessed value between the land and the property is going to pay a rate that ultimately results in it paying approximately 1% of its value in tax. What we're proposing here is that a undeveloped lot would pay what fundamentally amounts to 2% of its value in tax. So the bare land example of, say, a $100,000 lot adjacent to a lot that's ultimate assessed value is $400,000 would have the $4,000 house or $400,000 house paying $4,000 in taxes, and the bare lot paying $2,000 in taxes. So there's still a big discrepancy in those particular cases, but like I say, any ratio is appropriate. There are a number of municipalities across the province that utilize this. This is allowed under the Municipal Government Act. There are any number of examples of municipalities that do this. Ratios vary between municipalities. It's up to each individual council to decide what's appropriate. The city of St. Albert, for example, uses the 1.25 to 1 ratio. The town of Kalmar has a more aggressive ratio of approximately, I think it's times about 1.75 in their case. So there's any number of approaches that council might want to consider with respect to something like this. We also provide for some definition with respect to how determination of vacant status is made, or how the reversion to a standard tax rate is accomplished once development occurs, to ensure that this isn't intended to be a long-term application to any property, and rather is sort of a tool that's to adjust for very specific periods. Taking a broad brush look at the policy as it's crafted here, it appears that there might be somewhere in the range of 12 properties in the town that would be applicable to this particular variation of this policy based on meeting the 5-year age criteria and various other elements of the policy. So it's certainly not something that is widespread. It is a tool, however, to address concerns for properties that have remained vacant for a long period of time, and there does not appear to be an incentive by the landholder to move forward with development. So. Lastly, I will address, I did have the opportunity to consider the policy in discussion with some legal counsel. As I said, these policies are common across the province. The legal opinion here was that the municipality absolutely has the right to do this. The municipal government allows for it. Consideration that perhaps a more effective means of doing this would be to pass a bylaw, basically fundamentally proposing the same, rather than passing it as a policy. The legal opinion was that was cleaner. From my perspective, I have no issue with passing it as a policy. This isn't something that would take effect prior to a mill rate bylaw being passed anyway, so there's no rush to pass something like this today, and a bylaw could certainly be prepared for presentation in conjunction with a mill rate bylaw or just in advance of a mill rate bylaw. So my recommendation would be to follow the legal advice and simply rewrite this as a bylaw.
Thank you, Cameron.
You bet.
Councilor Holm has a question or comment?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just the question, Cam, is it possible to put in also as an exemption the original subdivision developer? Where I'm getting at is I would hate to have a developer come in, do a quarter section of land or 80 acre, whatever piece of land, and then we have an economic downturn and they can't sell the lots for that 5-year period, and now they're getting stuck with an increase in taxes, not because they're trying to bank some land to try and make a profit in the future where I'm run out and I'm going to buy 2 or 3 lots because they're cheap now and I'm going to sit on them for the next 25 years and give them to my grandkids.
Right.
This could seriously hinder a developer coming in, I think. So I'd like to see if there's a way to exempt the original subdivision developer from this policy so that it only affects those who are actually going in and buying a land and want to sit on it. Thank you.
Okay. So to speak to that point, I certainly understand where you're coming from, and I think it's absolutely something I can look into. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I know there are sometimes issues with respect to this separation between land and ownership that sometimes come into play with these things, but I will consider that. I'll talk to the assessor and run that by legal counsel as well. And when we come forward to discuss this again, I'll have a clearer answer for that. The alternative question to consider with something like that is to consider that for the most part, developers aren't going to subdivide an entire quarter section in one go. They're going to create a certain number of lots to be sold over a certain number of years. And there's certainly an argument to be made that once the roads and the pipes and everything else are in place, that they start to depreciate in value, and that part of the approach with this type of application of a mill rate is to pay the replacement cost of that infrastructure. So if someone is sitting on a number of lots for, say, 20 years, by the time they're sold from the original developer to the new person, you might be 50% of the way through the lifespan. So it's a difficult thing to balance. So it's, but I will have an answer for council to consider with respect to whether we can specifically do that.
Is that all? Okay. Then Councillor Chapman?
Yeah, thank you, Worship. I certainly concur with Councillor Holmes' question with regards to that, and whether you set a position where if it becomes applicable at 60%, full rather than vacant, or some kind of number. But anyway, that's I support that concept. A couple of questions in addition. The assessor that you're speaking about here, would that be congruent with their normal roles and work in assessing, values, or would there be an extra fee for this service?
It's difficult for me to answer very clearly. I would say that if there is an extra fee, it would be extremely minor because this is such a small number of properties. But realistically speaking, municipalities take 2 different approaches to assessment. Some have full-time staff that work as an assessment department, others contract assessment out. Coaldale falls in that second category where our assessment is done as a contracted service. So the contracted service provider that is contracted to do assessment would simply add this to their list of how they assess within town. So while I can't say with 100% certainty that there'd be no cost implications to the policy, I can say very confidently that it would be, at very worst, extremely minor.
Okay. Just a further question, Worship, through to Cam. I take it that the lands that would be addressed here would be the current lands zoned under the land use bylaw, and not any new annexed lands. Is that what I'm kind of reading here?
If the new annexed lands met the requirements of the policy, which is to say that they were, small enough parcels that they had full city services or full town services and all the rest of it, and they had been vacant for the period of time, then I would suggest that they would meet the criteria. But this does not, as far as I can tell, doesn't apply to any of those properties.
I think I would check that out, obviously, because I think that the agreement we have
Yeah.
with the annexation process is that we
Right.
would keep the current standard of taxation.
Absolutely. And any agreement that we have with those landowners would supersede anything here, because the agreement we have in place with them is that they're taxed under the county's rates. And so this wouldn't be part of the county's rates, as it were. So it's,
Would you recommend addressing that in this policy or this bylaw?
no, I think it would be just left to the original agreement. But
Councillor Simpson?
So the one question I have is, so if the property is considered a vacant property under that tax and a new owner purchases that land and wants to develop it within a year, but of course it takes time, would that, because of the new ownership, revert back to the original tax, like the original tax base?
no, change of ownership wouldn't cause the reversal. So what I would suggest from a, if I can put my economist hat on for a minute, is that what this is going to do is it's going to ultimately impact the price of a lot that someone is paying. So if someone is buying a lot that they know is at a higher tax rate, then conceivably they're going to want to pay slightly less for that property than another. So when someone is making a purchase like this, it'll be clear with respect to that lot that it's paid at a certain rate. And so if you buy a lot that is under these guidelines as these are written, then you're responsible for getting development going quickly to make that adjustment occur.
And I think we'll have time. My sense is that the preference is would be to draft a bylaw rather than just adopt the policy. So when the first draft of the bylaw comes, then if there's any other things that come to mind from today to then, that council can weigh in on, amending the first reading to accommodate these kinds of things as well. So we're not necessarily crafting or drafting the final product today anyway, from what I would suspect, because I would concur with the recommendation to go with the bylaw, and I think that's a more transparent type way of going as well. Any further questions? Councillor Chapman?
More of a comment, Your Worship, and everyone that I've talked with regarding this this idea is in full support of this.
Okay, so we have a number of recommendations. Does anybody care to support any recommendation? I would just Councillor Holm?
Need to table this until such time as Cam comes back with some additional information on the subdivision, original developer, etc. So I'd like to table any further motions on this until that time.
And we have a motion to table. All in favor? And I'm opposed. Okay. All right, good. Thank you, Cam. All right, and then we have 8.1. And 8.2 are close cousins of each other. Any questions on the either of those reports? Councillor Simpson?
I'll make a motion to accept those for information.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Simpson moves 8.1 and 8.2 for information. Any discussion? All in favor? Okay, that's carried unanimously. And then we have the update for 8.3 is quite self-explanatory. It's just to make sure that there's no confusion on the Easter holiday and that. We have Tuesday the council meeting instead of Monday, Easter Monday. So motion to receive that for information. Councilor Lloyd, all in favor? Okay. And then we have Cameron is going to give us a verbal update on the Economic Development Summit that happened.
Thank you. So as council's aware, we had an economic development summit of sorts here in Coaldale at the end of March. The South Grow Regional Initiative had their sort of annual economic meeting here we held at the Gem of the West. I was afforded the opportunity at that meeting to have 20 minutes of captive audience time at which I could regale the 70 or so folks in attendance with stories about what's happening in Coaldale. And let's see if this is working for me. So myself, along with our South Grow representative, had an opportunity to fundamentally to spend 20 minutes bragging about what's happening here in town and some of the things we're proud of. So I just thought I'd take you through at a very high level what it is we had a chance to talk about. So we had in attendance largely elected officials from some of the other member communities in South Grow, as well as some of their economic development or senior management folks. And in so doing, what we wanted to do is paint a picture of what has changed in Coaldale and about how Coaldale is growing and changing and modernizing at a pretty rapid rate these days. So we talk about 50% population growth over about the last dozen or so years, and about how we're working carefully and quickly towards preparing ourselves for substantially more growth with respect to things like our new municipal development plan and other things that we're working on administratively and engaging in public consultation on. We talked about council's decision to look into opportunities to enter into the residential development space as an opportunity for the town to practice what it preaches in terms of best practices in residential development, and also as an opportunity to diversify our revenue streams a little bit as an organization and provide for some supplementation to our tax base in terms of bringing money into the organization to work on the projects that we're so proud of. I had an opportunity to talk to folks about some of the work we're doing with respect to our parks and trails and new playgrounds and new spaces in town, and also an opportunity to highlight the facility, the multi-sport recreation facility that we've been talking a lot about and working closely with the school board on, which got some pretty rave reviews from some of the other communities that thought it was a pretty impressive project. Talked a little bit about our industrial park, particularly the bold step this community took to develop its own industrial space, and some of the great success that the county has seen, that the town has seen in so doing. Some of the growth we've experienced there, and some of the new infrastructure that we're going to be putting in to continue to accommodate that and to continue to grow our industrial lands in town, and how important it is for us and how we recognize the importance of that part of our growth. Talked a little bit about downtown as being sort of the last critical piece to the puzzle in terms of seeing that bringing that to a point where it's thriving and growing as well. Talk a little bit about our fire hall project, which is underway. Picture of Main Street there for everyone's enjoyment, which I'm sure everyone can appreciate. And then obviously the announcement of Civic Square, which was part of our capital budget process, which was obviously a pretty huge initiative. So give people a sense of what we're talking about there with respect to combining a town hall with some commercial space, creating a community gathering space, providing for some additional parking downtown, and trying to check all of these boxes that we know are important to our ratepayers in terms of this project. And then lastly, just to highlight a little bit of what what my impression perhaps of our philosophy is as an organization in terms of the philosophy that I have seen our council govern with over the course of the 8 or so months that I've been part of the organization, which is to say, talk about how our approach being to, try to do things differently, try to understand what our asset base is and try to get the most out of those assets and try to find new and creative ways to generate revenue and to generate opportunity for this town. And how it's, we've set a very ambitious mandate for ourselves over the next couple of years and how we have plenty of work to do to get there and how we're all very excited. Feedback from the entire day and from the presentation in particular was extremely positive. Maybe that's just because people were being nice to me, but I can safely say that everyone from the surrounding communities was really blown away by everything that was happening here, and they're very excited to see where we go with it. So.
Thanks for the update, Cameron. Is there any questions or comments through to Cameron from members of council? Councillor Holm?
I did attend that day, and I think Cam did a spectacular job of highlighting Coaldale to that group, and he needs to have a little pat on the back at times, and that's one of them. So,
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much for that report, and I'm glad it went so well. And motion to receive that for information. Councillor Holm, all in favor? Okay. Then we have the information items 11.1, 2, and 3. Are there any questions or comments with respect to any of those? I guess we can't really entertain number 11.1 until we see where the borrowing bylaw goes and if we have any place to host any of this. Okay, Councillor Chapman.
I'll move to accept 11.1.
Okay, thank you. All in favor? Okay. And I believe that concludes the public portion of the meeting. Would anybody care to move us into closed session? Councillor Lloyd, all in favor?